All right, so there's this guy, Ricky Bobby, and he's got this really important quote that's if you're not first, you're last. And I think that's true in NASCAR. In this context, it's that Bitcoin wasn't first, but it is last. And it's last because it works. And that it works enforcing its fixed supply. And that as I get in to describe what a blockchain is, and this is going to be a little bit more dense than the last subject, but I'm going to really focus on the logic. I need you to hold a few ideas in your head at the highest level. This idea that what Dhruv just communicated, that the fixed supply was the essential, the thing to make it work, the essential simplifying technical solution to make digital money work, the fixed supply. That a fixed supply is also the best form of money. That if you could be paid in a form of money that can't be printed, that is better than any other form of money, better than a form of money that could increase in supply by 1%, 2%, 3%, even arbitrarily get destroyed. A money that simply can't get printed at all is the best, and that money converges to one. Money converging to one is what helps allow all the noise to fall to the background. It's that it is not an opinion, and it's something that you are going to have to test with your own logic because it is an economic truth. It's not a coincidence, and people aren't hallucinating into, the thousands years of history of money, and they're not collectively hallucinating into Bitcoin. And that brings me to the importance of Bitcoin and its blockchain. This is going to be the logic that explains to you why only one blockchain is valuable or viable. And if I explain to you that there are three camps, Bitcoiners, crypto/blockchain enthusiasts, and Gen Pop, when they start to understand this, Gen Pop is relieved. They're happy. Like the noise gets to subside. The people that are genuinely interested in crypto and blockchain, they're genuinely disappointed when they come to understand this. And I'm telling you that for real. People will say, if it's just Bitcoin, that's sad because they think that blockchain is going to solve the world. The blockchain is going to solve car title and real estate title and any problem you can imagine. People even try to put beef on the blockchain. Didn't work. People got sued, like seriously sued. But it's no laughing matter. So it's all okay too, because everything's going to be built on Bitcoin, and everything that people envision Bitcoin or crypto to solve is just going to be solved on Bitcoin because money is every side of every other value transfer. And we'll talk about that in the last part. But anchored to those ideas, the fixed supply is the most important thing. Money converges to one. And this last one, which is, it doesn't matter what all crypto or blockchain says it wants to be. If there's a token and it's only valuable in exchange and it doesn't have a claim on a productive asset like a stock or a bond, it has to compete with money. They're all competing as money. Money does converge to one, and Bitcoin does have a fixed supply. So where does blockchain come in? Bitcoin and its blockchain are interdependent. I'm going to jump to this conclusion, and this is a blockchain decision tree from the Bitcoin standard, which I recommend you read. And it says, do you need digital cash? No, you don't need a blockchain. Yes, use Bitcoin. It's the only blockchain that matters. That's the conclusion of this, and we'll talk about why. The key insight here is that Bitcoin wouldn't work without its blockchain, and its blockchain would not be valuable without Bitcoin, the currency. One does not exist without the other. So what is a blockchain? A blockchain is simply an invention native to Bitcoin that enables the removal of third parties in currency transactions. It serves no other purpose. Now, to conceptualize it, people oftentimes think about the blockchain as this amorphous thing in the cloud that everyone's committing transactions to. That's not the case. There is no one blockchain. Everyone within the Bitcoin network is maintaining their own version of a blockchain, and what that blockchain represents is the ordering of Bitcoin transactions. Why is the ordering of Bitcoin transactions important? Because if we have this fixed money supply and it's going to power the future. We need to be able to send it to each other. And if I'm going to send you a Bitcoin, the network has to know whether I'm the actual valid holder of it and if I can actually transfer it to you and validate it as being true. And there is this inherent relationship and importance of money and the immutability of records. So if the blockchain is this function to order currency transactions, and it's important to order currency transactions because we're actually using money to affect trade. Money is just a tool, and we use the tool to affect trade to build things like cars and real estate and schools, that it's very important to know what transactions happen first, such that people can spend it and only spend it once. This is referred to as the double spending problem. But money is also no good if the records are not immutable. And what do I mean by that? It's that if a blockchain has a set of records that are easily subject to change, the money can't work. The fixed supply is no good. And that immutability is actually an emergent property of Bitcoin, not a property inherent to blockchain. Again, I told you that the word decentralization is trivialized. The idea that you can just put something on the blockchain and that the system just works is similarly naive. And that if Bitcoin's records were not immutable, it would not be valuable or viable as a currency. So let me give you an example. Imagine you gave me your car and I gave you Bitcoin. If Bitcoin's records were immutable, or were mutable, if they were changeable, if they were subject to arbitrary change, I could end up with your car and my money, and you would end up without your car and without any money. The system doesn't work in that environment. Now, let me go to the other side of the example. Let's talk about cars, because people want to put car titles and real estate titles on the blockchain. Bitcoin tracks and enforces ownership. It at all times tracks and enforces who has the currency and helps validate currency transactions. At this moment, people are sending Bitcoin from every nook and cranny of the world, and all the money's getting to the right place, and no one can steal other people's money. And it's doing all that without a central coordinator. It is doing two things: tracking ownership and importantly, enforcing ownership. If a blockchain cannot do both, it's not valuable. So let's think about it in the context of car title. We could possibly reimagine putting all or car title onto a blockchain. You can't enforce the transfer of the car. You can't. That's a physical process. It's inherently detached from a digital reality. Separately, let's say that you did get those records on a blockchain. The problem still exists. Imagine title transfers from me to you for the car, but these records are not secure and the title goes back to you. It comes back to the same problem that you need something to secure the records. So we need to think about it in the context of Bitcoin. Well, what secures the records? Well, in the context of Bitcoin, as Dhruv was mentioning, it's power, real world power. Currently, the Bitcoin network is secured by 20 to 30 gigawatts of power 24/7. This is an example of a Bitcoin mine about an hour from here out in Rockdale, Texas, that's run by Riot, that has about 700 megawatts of power running 24/7, securing the Bitcoin network. What pays for that power? One thing: Bitcoin. What needs to be secured? The records of ownership of Bitcoin. The records would not be secure if there weren't a currency to pay for it. And importantly, in this context, when people provide this proof of work, when they run this power to secure the fixed supply and ensure that when a currency transaction is sent, that it's actually valid and it can only be spent once, that those people running the power get paid trustlessly. That it's not dependent on a central third party, whether or not if they do the work, they get paid. That is not true in a centralized system. Can't be true. It's always dependent on trust. One thing has to be delivered first. And this is where we come to a more simplifying idea. It is that Bitcoin is the only secure blockchain. Money converges to one. This is a chart on the right of Bitcoin's hash rate. 5 years ago, it was at 100 exahashes. You don't have to know what 100 exahashes is. Today, it's at 800. 8 times more. In 2017, there was only 5 exahashes securing the Bitcoin network. So today, it is 160 times more secure. China banned Bitcoin mining in 2021. That's that small little blip right there. Bitcoin hash rate temporarily cut in half, and now we're 8 times higher. The Bitcoin network didn't stop working. But more importantly, the Bitcoin hash rate is 800 exahashes. The next most secure system has 4 exahashes. In reality, the next most secure is not secure at all. Could you imagine storing your money in a network that is 200 times less secure when you had the option to secure your money or your money in a network that is 200 times more secure? It's not a question of 51% and 49. It's 200 to 1, but it's also not a coincidence why all value accrues to Bitcoin. It's because money converges to one and there's only one valuable blockchain. And this is the end logic as to why you don't need any other crypto, you don't need any other blockchain, you just need Bitcoin. The money converging to one blockchain reality. It's that money converges to one, and a blockchain needs a native currency for security. So if you accept this premise that money converges to one and that a blockchain is only good in the context of money because it needs something to pay for security and the records will not be safe if they're not immutable and they won't be able to be relied upon. Consequence is that there is only one currency, only one blockchain that is viable or valuable, and that the world is converging on Bitcoin because it has a credibly enforced fixed supply, not just we say that it's 21 million and therefore everyone must accept it by fiat. That it's credibly enforced, and it's only credibly enforced because of the decentralized nature of it and because it has this record system that is actually immutable that people can rely on. But if I talk about the immutability being important, decentralization being important, how Bitcoin is 200 times more secure and functionally it's the only one that's more secure, it wasn't always that case. It had to get to that point. And Dhruv is going to talk about how Bitcoin got from inception to this highly robust, highly decentralized system that does have this important emergent property of immutability.
Thank you, Parker. Okay, so as Parker was saying, so Bitcoin has this tremendous hash rate, right? Thousands of developers, millions of people using this, provides it great support in being decentralized. But how did it get here? It wasn't obvious, by the way, that it would ever get here. I think people who have been in Bitcoin for a decade or more may feel some pride in that, despite not having any certainty that we would arrive at this point, that we somehow did anyway. I've created this little diagram here because I want to try to highlight the relationship between two different ideas. Number one is the notion of centralization versus decentralization here on the left and right axis. And then the other is the notion of scale, right? So low scale, small systems with a small number of users, a small amount of volume, or a small market capitalization at the bottom. And then globally important high scale systems that everyone uses that are ascendant at the top, right? So my claim is that there's kind of a red arrow, a pattern on this diagram that we as engineers, as technologists, really like and really understand. And that is, how do we make something run at an incredibly high scale by making it very, very strongly controlled in a centralized way, by making sure that all its parts are functioning, they're well tested, there's no adversarial or unexpected behavior. That's how we deliver services like Google. That's how we deliver ChatGPT. That's how Amazon's logistic business is able to actually operate at the scale that it does. It's very, very well controlled. But none of those projects were inspirations for Satoshi, right? Satoshi mentions different projects if you read the white paper, right? Napster, Nutella, Tor, right? These are more quote unquote decentralized options. Now, Napster is not that decentralized, which is ultimately why it failed in the Satoshi quote. But Nutella and Tor, these were file sharing or internet like networks that were meant to provide a sort of anonymous or open way to be able to access information much before Bitcoin was really out there. But it's important where I place them on this graph. They never really scaled past this sort of lower scale part of that. They never became high scale projects, right? And why is that? Well, let's ask a slightly different one that might be a little bit more familiar to folks. Let's talk about email, which everyone has familiarity with. If you were using email in the 90s, you might recognize that tiny icon despite its incredibly low resolution. That's the interface to Pine, right? Like when in that era, when you were accessing email, it's because you ran your own email server or your small university did or your small company did. There was nothing like Gmail, right? Now, what happened? What made Gmail necessary historically? It's spam. If you used email in that era, you got a lot of spam, increasingly more as the internet became more and more popular and more people started getting on email as a distributed network. One solution was Hashcash, which we just looked at last time I was up here talking. That turned out not to work. Instead of charging people some number of computations to send email, which was the sort of Hashcash solution, we decided, let's just let Google read all our emails. And then they'll tell us which ones are spam or not. That's what the market literally chose. That seemed to work better. Now, why is that? Like, why couldn't email solve that problem in a decentralized way? Why did Nutella ultimately never succeed as the method by which we share files today, 20 years later? Like, why is Tor basically captured by the government? And why did Bitcoin succeed? Uniquely out of all these projects, why did it escape that bottom right hand corner and become both decentralized as well as very high scale? The answer is not blockchain. We know this, right? It's not the blockchain. The answer is economic incentives. Bitcoin, uniquely on that slide that we were just seeing, is money, right? And that means we can pay people in Bitcoin to do things for us. We can create strong economic incentives to keep the network operating by paying people in Bitcoin. When we're thinking about the context of a file sharing program like Nutella or a internet sort of dark web program like Tor, there's a lot of risk and a lot of obligation without any income. So people tend to not do it. And adversarial behavior is very hard to control, and spam is very hard to control because we can't charge people anything, right? Again, if we tried to bring money into email or file sharing or private networks, we would immediately run into centralization concerns. How are we going to charge people, right? Because Bitcoin is itself a kind of money, it was able to solve this problem. And you might argue that in some sense, the very first system to become really high scale and decentralized has to be a kind of money. Nothing else could ever get there because nothing else is going to be able to solve that problem of how will I pay people in order to operate the network and thereby avoid adversarial behavior and scale cooperation, right? It's done through economic incentives. As this little devil character says, when playing by the rules is more profitable than acting adversarially, we are scaling cooperative behavior. So what this really tells us, right, is that decentralization, again, it comes from economic incentives, and markets are the structures we use to encode economic perspectives at scale to create cooperation. And in some sense, this shouldn't be surprising, right? We're Americans. We know that markets are incredibly powerful. We won the Cold War, right, based on the power of markets, their ability to coordinate human beings at scale and optimize resource allocation and service discovery, right? A blockchain is a passive data structure. How could the blockchain cause all these fantastical outcomes that we traditionally associate with giant, efficient, robust markets? The answer is it cannot. I think if you are someone that believes the blockchain is the solution to your problem, mirroring Parker's last slide, you're kind of wrong. I think you're in a cult. I think you're in a blockchain cargo cult. That you have made the following false syllogism: Bitcoin is decentralized, Bitcoin has a blockchain, therefore blockchains cause decentralization. And I think that is false. And I want to continue to convince you of that in the next few slides here. Indeed, Bitcoin is literally made of markets. The functions that we need from a currency, namely releasing tokens into circulation so they can be used as money and settling transactions amongst users, those functions which a currency must provide are provided through markets which incentivize their providers by offering them Bitcoin in exchange for their services. We've already talked about this market to some degree in the first set of slides. This is the market to release Bitcoin into circulation. In this market, miners are offering computation in return for Bitcoin. And this is really how this market works. And this is the best possible way to think about it. A market you may be more familiar with is the market that you've used if you've ever yourself sent a Bitcoin transaction, right? This is the market for settling Bitcoin transactions amongst users once Bitcoins are already in circulation. And this market trades block space, again, for Bitcoins. A theme that will recur throughout this presentation is we're always trading for Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the world's best money and is one half of every value transfer, and therefore will always cause the incentives that we're seeking to promote, right? In this market, when you set your transaction fee, you are making a bid against other users to be included in the upcoming block that the miner is creating so that your transaction can be settled. This is very much a market process. And this is how I think Bitcoin operates. Bitcoin has created layers of markets which are coupled to each other, in which service providers are paid in Bitcoin so that we can scale cooperative behavior and not have adversarial behavior. If you are a miner, it really is more profitable to you to just play by the rules and don't try to grief the system or subvert it in any way. We could get even further. We could talk about the details of order books and order magic and trade settlement and price discovery. And I think these ideas are totally fascinating, but I don't have time for it. So we'll move on to the next idea, which is what we ultimately value about Bitcoin, just to repeat it, comes from markets, right? The notions of growth, availability, the uncensorability, the ability to defend, and the fixed supply. All of these ideas come from this notion of a very, very powerful market in which people are always going to show up because they want to make money. In fact, they want to make the best money in the world. They want to make Bitcoin. Returning back to this little diagram, I want to give you a couple more examples that help illustrate how important the monetary value of Bitcoin and the size of the market are, and how unimportant the blockchain is in creating those same outcomes. Let me take a brief, quick survey poll. How many people in the audience have heard of the Bitcoin testnet? That's actually about half of us for folks that aren't able to see what I'm seeing. How many have heard of things like Signet or RegTest? Okay, slightly less, maybe about 20% or so. Mostly just Unchained employees raising their hand at this point in the audience. Okay, wonderful. I want to just talk about this very briefly. I think this is a very cool idea. And it's something that really helped convince me early in my own thinking about Bitcoin as to why the monetary properties were so useful, why it was indeed Bitcoin, not blockchain, and not the other way around. So as a developer, when I interact with Bitcoin, guess what I don't want to have happen? I don't want to make a mistake in my code and wind up destroying a bunch of Bitcoin in the process, right? That's a very bad outcome. And developers, even good ones, will make mistakes. We will cause bugs and Bitcoin might get destroyed. So what did we decide to do as developers who want to work on Bitcoin? We made a fake version of Bitcoin. We cloned Bitcoin. It's the exact same thing. It has a blockchain. It has proof of work. It has private keys. It is the same in every single way except for two. It has a different Genesis block so we can distinguish it. And its coins are not worth anything. There is a wonderful quote here on this page from a early testnet faucet, which we used to use, that I think really captured the paradoxical idea of a money that was created to have no value, right? It's a very weird idea. But something that you should know if you're not a developer is that the Bitcoin testnet does not work. Why is that? Well, routinely, our experience, the developers who use the testnet, is we'll try to use it. We're expecting blocks to come so we can test our code. Nothing happens for 7 hours. Why? Well, because no one's getting paid to sell computations to the testnet network because the coins aren't worth anything. The market has collapsed, and therefore the service is no longer available. It has a blockchain. Why isn't the blockchain stepping up and fixing the problem? Because it cannot. It is a passive data structure that without an active market operating behind it is useless and performs nothing. How do we actually fix this problem, by the way, as developers, right? When testnet doesn't work for us because it's unreliable, because no one's getting paid to run it. We centralized, right? Testnet is something that's available globally, just like Bitcoin. Instead, we decided to create little private copies of Bitcoin, corporate blockchains that we control. In our engineering team, for example, at Unchained, we operate many of these private blockchain corporate thingies. I don't think much of the world even understands that these things exist, but we find them very useful because now we can immediately control what we want to do. We can test our code with granularity and predictability and reproducibility. But what did we have to do? We took away the monetary properties of Bitcoin. It started failing. It stopped delivering on its value. And then we centralized it to get back control so that it would do what we wanted it to do, right? That is what happens if you take away the monetary properties of the token and the size and scale and the motivation to interact with it in a real open market. Does that make sense? What if you are still bullheaded and you insist that, no, I don't care. I still want to use the blockchain. I love the blockchain. I want to put everything into the blockchain, as Parker was mentioning before. Real estate records, car title, whatever else. Like, I think you're wrong, but you should also ask yourself a question. Is it really true that I can take this structure that is working right now and has been historically at releasing coins into circulation and settling transactions? Can I really bloat it with all those other concerns? And if I do, what will be the back reaction on the quality of the underlying markets which power the blockchain, of which the blockchain is really just a ledger of receipts of trades in those markets? What will happen to those markets if I insist on making this mechanism incredibly more, if I put a huge amount of demands on it? What will happen? Will the market remain decentralized or will it become centralized? Well, it will become centralized. Let's look at some real examples here. I'm not going to go through this table in absolute detail, but the largest points I want to make, these are the projects that are most famous for inventing, creating, synthesizing, promoting the blockchain cargo cult, right? They claim that they can do so much more than Bitcoin can because of the greater capabilities of their blockchain. And by the way, at this point in my life, when I hear statements like that, I hear, we're the best store because our receipts are the best. Does that make sense to you? It doesn't make sense to me, but that's what I hear when people say that, right? So, like, let's look at these numbers though, right? Like, when was Bitcoin's last outage? It's only had two in its history, and it was in 2013 when the network was so tiny that most people had never heard of it. It has not had an outage since that time ever. That's important. You do not want the world's global reserve currency to experience outages the way that Solana regularly does. What about monetary interventions? Right? Ethereum has had a whole sequence of monetary interventions as it's tried to transition from proof of work to proof of stake, which, by the way, I'm not even including in my comparison here. I think that's also a centralizing element, but I'm ignoring that aspect. I'm just trying to show you outcomes. We can talk a little bit about validators. It looks like Ethereum has a whole bunch of validators, but that million validator set, those are not people. Those are processes running on one of 12,000 nodes, far fewer than Bitcoin has full nodes, certainly far fewer than Bitcoin has individual miners trying to mine Bitcoin and earn it. So the picture that I see is I see a community, a set of communities, an entire side of the market that thinks it is working on protocols and blockchains and technology, and they're on the red path. They're going to centralize as they scale up, and it's going to appear impressive, but the second it butts up against, let's say, legal strictures or central regulation, it is going to crumple, right? If you think you're instead working on markets and money and economic incentives, if you're not writing smart contracts to program computers, you're instead creating incentives to program human beings, then you are on the orange arrow and you were headed up and to the right and you were going to scale and you were going to make decentralized. And as one final blow to this kind of thinking, I would say that even if you completely didn't listen to me, you did all these things, you built your centralized blockchain, you completely ignored all the things I'm saying, this is where you've gotten to. You have said, hey, it turns out we still need off-chain scaling anyway. We're going to have to build layer twos and roll-ups and sharding and all sorts of mechanisms because our blockchain is fundamentally not scaling because I can't put the entire market of the whole world in a receipt. And so what was the point of building that other blockchain in the first place? Why not just build everything on Bitcoin? So I'll hand it over to you, Parker.